Act 1. Cold Open. A white UN vehicle approaches a roadblock. Militias stand with machetes and rifles, their faces hard with purpose. The driver is alone. He does not stop. He does not speed. He rolls down the window, and what happens next will determine whether the people hidden beneath the tarps in his vehicle live or die. His name is Captain Addi Bâ, a Senegalese army officer serving as a military observer. In the next 55 days, he will become the most dangerous man in Rwanda, not because he carries a gun, but because he refuses to look away. Act 2. Context. On April 7, 1994, the Rwandan genocide began. A plane carrying President Juvenal Habyarimana was shot down near Kigali. Within hours, roadblocks appeared. Machetes were distributed. Hutu extremists, organized through radio broadcasts and militia networks called the Interahamwe, began systematically murdering Tutsis and moderate Hutus. By the end of that first day, thousands were dead. By the end of the first week, tens of thousands. The genocide would last 100 days. When it ended, between 800,000 and 1 million people had been murdered. The United Nations had a presence in Rwanda. UNAMR, the UN Assistance Mission for Rwanda, had deployed military observers under a Chapter 6 mandate. That meant they could observe, report, and advise. They could not fight. They could not intervene. They could only watch. General Romeo Dallaire, the Canadian commander, pleaded for reinforcements and a stronger mandate. He was refused. His force of 2,500 soldiers was ordered to remain neutral, to protect themselves, and to evacuate foreign nationals. They were not there to save Rwandans. Captain Addi arrived in Rwanda as a Senegalese army officer attached to UNAMR. He was 36 years old. He had been deployed as a military observer. He had no special training in rescue operations. He had no authorization to conduct them. What he had was a white UN vehicle, a Senegalese accent, a uniform, and a conscience that would not permit him to drive past a checkpoint and do nothing. Act 3. Rising Action. On the morning of April 7th, hours after the genocide began, Addi learned that Prime Minister Agatha Uwilingiyimana, a moderate Hutu who had opposed the extremists, had been assassinated. Her home was surrounded. Her children were missing. Addi drove to her house alone, moving through streets already thick with smoke and the sound of machetes striking metal gates. He found 5 of her children hidden by their parents in the dark of an interior room, terrified, waiting to be found by killers who were methodically working through the neighborhood. He put them in his vehicle and drove toward the UN compound at Amahoro Stadium. Between him and safety stood militia checkpoints, young men with red armbands, machetes, and orders to kill anything that moved. At each checkpoint, Addi did not negotiate from fear. He negotiated from authority. He was UN. He was armed with a sidearm. He was Senegalese, not Rwandan, not Tutsi, not a target. He carried cash, cigarettes, and beer. He smiled. He spoke. He bribed. He charmed. He drove through. The children reached safety. That was the first rescue. It would not be the last.
Over the next weeks, Diagne established a pattern that defied logic and survival. He would receive information, sometimes from other UN personnel, sometimes from Rwandans who knew he would listen, about Tutsis in hiding, about families separated, about people trapped in their homes as killers moved through neighborhoods with lists and photographs. He would drive his white vehicle into the chaos, the paint itself a kind of prayer. He would navigate checkpoints, sometimes as many as 23 in a single trip, each one a negotiation conducted in the shadow of genocide. At each one he would use the same method: authority, personality, bribery, and an almost reckless audacity that suggested he believed his UN uniform was a shield that could not be pierced. He would hide people under tarps in his vehicle. He would hide them behind seats. He would hide them in the engine compartment, pressed against the heat of the engine, breathing shallow. He would drive them to the Hôtel des Mille Collines, where a Belgian hotel manager named Paul Rusesabagina was sheltering hundreds of Tutsis behind locked doors and careful lies, or to the UN compound at Amahoro Stadium, where Dallaire's forces maintained a fragile perimeter against the tide. Each trip was a gamble. Each checkpoint was a moment where a single suspicious militia commander could end everything, could end him, could end the people hidden in his vehicle, could end the possibility of rescue itself. Yet he drove. Again and again he drove. Act 4. Turning Point. But Diagne kept driving, and the numbers grew. 50 people saved, 100, 200. By late April, it became clear that this was not a one-time act of courage. This was a sustained campaign of rescue conducted by a single man in a single vehicle, operating without authorization against the explicit neutrality mandate of his own force, in direct violation of the rules of engagement that forbade UNMER personnel from intervening in the genocide. Night after night he navigated the checkpoints, up to 23 in a single journey through Kigali's fractured streets. At each one he faced the same choice: bribe, charm, negotiate, or turn back. He chose none of those things. He chose to keep going. His white UN vehicle became a ghost that moved through the darkness, carrying the hunted to safety in compounds across the city. The Entourage knew his face by then. They knew his vehicle, and still he came. General Dallaire knew what Diagne was doing. He did not stop him. He could not stop him, not without betraying his own conscience. Dallaire would later say that Diagne was the bravest man he had ever met. Journalist Mark Doyle, who covered the genocide for the BBC, would say the same. They watched a man drive into hell again and return with the living. The estimates of how many Diagne saved vary. Some sources suggest 600, others suggest over 1,000. The exact number will never be known. What is known is that each person he saved had a family, had a future, had a life that would not have existed if Diagne had obeyed his orders and remained neutral. In a time of systematic murder, he chose to be systematic about mercy instead. Act 5. Consequences.
On May 31, 1994, Diagne was returning from a rescue mission. He was driving toward an RPF checkpoint, the rebel force that would eventually stop the genocide. A mortar shell exploded near his vehicle. He was killed instantly. He was 36 years old. He had been in Rwanda for 55 days. He was 12 days away from the end of his deployment. His body was returned to Senegal. He received a state funeral, the casket draped in the flag of his nation, carried by soldiers who understood what he had done. For years afterward, his story remained largely unknown outside Rwanda and the circles of those who had worked with UNMER. The world moved on. The genocide faded from headlines. Rwanda began the long work of rebuilding and remembering, of counting the dead and searching for meaning in the wreckage. But Diagne's legacy did not fade. In 2004, a decade after the killing stopped, the PBS documentary Ghosts of Rwanda brought his story to a wider audience. Survivors spoke his name. They described the white UN vehicle appearing through the smoke and chaos. They described being lifted into the back seat, driven past checkpoints where death waited. In 2014, 20 years after his death, the United Nations created the Captain Mbaye Diagne Medal for Exceptional Courage, the highest honor a UN peacekeeper can receive. It is awarded to those who demonstrate extraordinary bravery in the face of extreme danger while serving the United Nations. The medal bears his name. A statue of Diagne stands at the Kigali Genocide Memorial Center, where survivors and visitors come to remember not just the dead, but the one man who refused to accept that their deaths were inevitable. He stands there still, in bronze, a quiet witness to what one person can do when conscience demands it. Act 6. Reflection. Captain Mbaye Diagne did not stop the Rwandan genocide. 800,000 people still died. The world still failed Rwanda. But in the midst of that failure, one man chose to act. He chose to see the people in front of him and to risk everything to save them. He did not wait for authorization. He did not wait for the world to act. He drove his white vehicle into the darkness, again and again, until the darkness took him. His story is not a story of victory. It is a story of what one person can do when they refuse to be complicit in atrocity. It is a story that deserves to be remembered, not as an exception to the rule of human cruelty, but as a reminder that the rule can be broken. If forgotten heroes are the footnotes you follow, the next one is already waiting to be found.